Go.
I'd like to welcome you all to this special remote Tuesday tour. Today we're going to be talking about the Greystone dwelling through the eyes of visiting Shakers, who mostly came in the 1840s and 1850s. Beside me right now is a door on the south side of the Greystone dwelling. Today, when visitors come here, they often think of the west side of the building, which is just over there, as the front. But during the Shaker era, the south side would have been the front entrance. This was the brothers' front entrance. And down the way here would have been the sisters' front entrance. If you look at these doorways, they've been recently restored and they're looking great with their green and white paint. And so I'd like to get into our tour. We're going to talk about the Greystone dwelling and really the characteristics that made this building special for the Shakers who came here to see this site. The Shaker community in Enfield was founded in 1793. It started with the construction of a meeting house just off the lawn here. And then they basically kept on building through the early 1880s when they completed the ministry house. In Enfield, there were three Shaker families. There was a North family, which was the gathering order. And then there was a church family, which was the center of the community. And then the South family, which is about a mile down the road from where we are currently. The Shaker population in Enfield greatly expanded throughout the 1790s and the early 1800s. And by the 1830s, the Shakers in Enfield began to think about how they would need a larger dwelling space for their growing community. And so in about 1834, they start to make plans. They start to move buildings on the site and prepare this location right here for the site of this large stone dwelling house. Today we call it the Greystone dwelling. The Shakers just call it the house or the stone house. Construction officially begins in 1837. The early construction is supervised by an architect they hired named Amy Burnham Young. They are able to put up the masonry structure of the building in just a year, which is incredibly impressive, especially when we think of building projects today. And then the Shakers are going to spend the next 3.5 years completing all of the interior finishing work, which we'll see shortly. In 1841, the building is inhabited for the first time, and at the time in the Shaker world, this is a fairly revolutionary structure. Some Shaker visitors love this building. They think it's the future for their communities. Others struggle a little bit with some of the design choices that the Shaker elders and trustee Caleb Dyer made on this design. And so I'd like to move over to the west side of the building before we enter. Thank you for joining us. Now we're on the west side of the Greystone dwelling. And you can see some really interesting details on this side. One is the sheer mass of the building. This is a 4-story building. It has a 2-story attic, and it also has a full basement. So you have 7 full levels of this building that would have been used by the Shakers for a variety of tasks, for storage, for workspace. This side of the building also shows some of the classic masonry building techniques. So you have uniform cut blocks being used in this structure. This is different than some of the other structures made from stone on this site that use a wide variety of materials. Here we're purely using locally sourced granite for this structure. Another really interesting detail you can see up at the roof line is in soapstone is a carving that shows the date that they began construction, which is 1837. Another interesting detail to know about the Greystone dwelling is that it is the only Greek Revival dwelling house constructed by the Shakers. It's a little hard on this side of the building to see that, but if you ever get a chance to join us in Enfield, if you look at the east portico, you can see the stone columns that show that it is a sign of this era of building and this style of architecture. I'd like to welcome you to join us on the inside of the building now. Welcome back. After moving into the west side brothers door of the Greystone dwelling, one of the first rooms you'd encounter would be this, the brothers gathering room. The brothers gathering room is often called a saloon, which is sort of a localization of the word salon, the French salon. And in this room, the brothers would have met before meals. This would have been a room to get washed up, which was a requirement before entering the dining room. This would have also been a room for silent prayer and contemplation as well. Another purpose of this really interesting space is this very large wall of drawers, built-in drawers behind me and cabinets. This served a very particular purpose for the Enfield Shakers. Each of these drawers functioned sort of like a modern male P.O. box. Every brother had a drawer. His clothes, after being laundered by the sisters in a separate structure, they would have had their clothes put in these drawers, and they would have been expected to retrieve them and bring them up to the retiring rooms upstairs. This would have saved the sisters a lot of work, going up and down the many flights of stairs in this building, but it also would have prevented the sisters from having to enter the brothers' rooms. Before we leave this space, I would like to read you just a short passage from an 1843 account by Elder Giles Avery, who was a member of the New Lebanon ministry. He writes, "A large sitting room to go into when coming into victuals. Around the sides of this are drawers and cupboards to put clothes in, which are brought from the wash. In order to save sisters from going into brethren's rooms to put away such clothes, water is brought into the sitting room where the brethren can wash or get water to drink on the Sabbath without going into the kitchen." And so this is the brothers' gathering room. From this space, the brothers would have prepared themselves and then moved on to our next space in this tour, which will be the dining room of the Greystone dwelling. Welcome to the Greystone dwelling dining room. Before we proceed with the rest of the room, I'd like to talk a little bit about the interior paint in this building. And to do this, I'd like to read just a short passage from a Shaker journal that talks about a quote from Elder Orville Dyer discussing the interior of this building. He says, "The house is all painted white inside and well furnished with drawers and cupboards. There are 800 drawers in the house, one side of their dining room wall, which is set full of door cupboards and drawers. Elder Orville said there was not a box or chest in the house. The paint is very smooth and glossy, which you can see on the trim all along the wall here. In order to get this effect," he says, "Elder Orville says they finish by dipping the paintbrush in boiled oil just as the paint is drying, and brush it over. By this means, the oil becomes a varnish which looks elegantly when dry." And so as we move around this dining room, you're going to get a sense of the original color scheme of this building. This has been an ongoing project for our preservation team, and you're going to get the effect of your raw white plaster walls, which we know about through Shaker journals, with this glossy white trim. And you'll see that as we move around the building. And then, to contrast with the white, you have these very dark, almost mahogany colored pegs. And so let's move over here so we can see this wall a little bit better. So another important characteristic in this room before we move on to the purpose of this room are these columns that are painted white. These columns are just one more sign of the Greek Revival stylings that you find in this building, in the moldings and other elements. So this dining room was used by the church family after construction finished in 1841. The sisters would have dined on the south side of the room. The brothers would have dined on the north side. The Shakers in this space had a little bit of a problem because this entire dwelling house is split into two sections. The west half is for the brothers, and the east half is for the sisters. But on the ground level of the Greystone dwelling, the sisters lose almost their entire space to public areas such as the kitchen and the bake room. So as a compromise to the rest of the structure of the building, they had to put the sisters' gathering room on the brothers' side. If you look at this doorway over here, you wouldn't want two brothers or sisters entering through this doorway at the same time, as the Shakers were a celibate community. And so instead, they construct separate entrances for the brothers and the sisters. The brothers' entrance is this open doorway at the north side of the room. At the south side of the room, over here, is the sisters' entrance to the dining room. After a short period of usually about 10 minutes in the gathering room, sisters and brothers would have come into this dining room, and they would have proceeded over to the table where they usually sat. We're going to move over to this table here, which is an original Enfield dining table for the church family. This table is unique. It's not something that most of us would have in our house. It's about 21.5 feet long. The top of it is 2 pieces of solid yellow birch. And originally, the color scheme of this table would have been a dark mahogany brown stain. that would have been polished with most likely a similar oil procedure to what was used on the trim in this room. Shaker meals are a little bit different than what we're used to at home. You had 15 minutes to eat, and you were expected to do this in complete silence. Hervey Elkins goes even so far as to say you weren't allowed to blink, and we'll read more of his interesting passage in a moment. But if you look over here, how do you have a meal with up to 80 people without anybody having to ask to pass salt, pepper, sauces, etc.? How the Shakers get around this is every table is set up in a 4 square, which you can see right here. The idea behind this 4 square is that everyone will be able to grab whatever they need without having to ask the person next to them to pass the salt or the pepper. So in the meantime right now, I'd like to read the short passage from Hervey Elkins that describes this procedure in detail. He says, in the senior order, which is the church family, at the ringing of a large bell 10 minutes before mealtime, all may gather into the saloons and retire for 10 minutes before the dining hall alarm summons them to the table. All enter 4 doors and gently arrange themselves at their respective places at the table. Then all simultaneously kneel in thanks for nearly a minute. Then rise and seat themselves almost inaudibly at the table. No talking, laughing, whispering, or blinking are allowed while thus partaking of God's blessings. After eating, all rise together at the signal of the first elder, kneel as before, and gently retire to the places of vocation, without stopping in the dining hall, loitering in the corridors and vestibules, or lounging upon the balustrades, doorways, and stairs. And so that's Hervey Elkins' really interesting description of how this dining space was used. Now, if you look at this dining table in front of us, you'll notice that the whole table is set up with dishware. This dishware was not produced by the Shakers. It came from a company called J.G. Needham, which is based in England, and so it's whiteware. And how we know so much about this table and sort of the general layout of the table settings is we've used stereograph images from the 1870s and 1880s to try to reconstruct this table to what it would look like. These stereographs were produced locally, some by a photographer named W.G.C. Kimball, and they give us a very good sense of what the dining room may have looked like during the Shaker period. Before we leave this dining room, I'd like to move down to the far end of the room here, where we have one of the built-ins. This built-in's a little interesting because it's a little bit different than the other ones in this room. It seems to be more of a standalone piece. It's even possible that maybe this was added late in construction when they realized that they needed more room for storage in this dining space. But what I really like to show visitors here is if you open this built-in up, on the inside is not white paint, it's this beautiful dark red paint. This dark red paint is found throughout this dining space and on other places on the first floor of the Greystone dwelling. And in the Shaker world, colors can sometimes be interpreted from a spiritual perspective, and sometimes red is referred to as a color of tribulation in the Shaker world. And so this is the dining room. I hope you can continue with us on this tour and join us on the second floor for a retiring room. Now we're in one of the 24 retiring rooms that the Shakers had in the Greystone dwelling. And the image you're looking at right now, this comes from a stereograph from an image in the 1880s and shows a section of one of the Shaker rooms in this building. You can see in this image the combination of Victorian styling with the Shakers' own classical design, such as the chairs in the image. If you pan over here for a second, what you'll see is one of the many Shaker built-ins in the dwelling house. When Shakers moved into one of these retiring rooms, they'd be assigned a series of drawers for their own personal use, and usually a section of peg rail as well. A room of this size would typically house anywhere between 3 and 4 Shakers, sometimes as many as 5. This particular room is a little unique in that the rooms on the second floor of the Greystone dwelling were used by older members of the community. And anytime you come here as a visitor, you realize the sheer amount of stairs in this building would make it very challenging to get around. And so these rooms were often referred to as either the aged brothers or aged sisters rooms. And we know this particular detail through preservation work. We found information on the backs of stops and some of the window frames, and that's how we know that these rooms were used. Now, if you look at this building for a second, so this is a pretty typical design. You have your cupboard on the top, multiple drawers, and then at the bottom you have these two little interesting doors. And these serve a very unique purpose for the Shakers. Cleanliness was important in this community and in all of the rest of the Shaker villages. And so one of the standards of that cleanliness is a large number of people in this room who did not have indoor plumbing. And so instead people are using chamber pots at night when they're not using privies during the day. And so if you look down here, you have these little chambers. They would store their chamber pot in here. It's lined with metal sheeting, and at the back there would have been a vent that would have connected to the chimney. And so a Shaker would have slid a chamber pot in here. They have this little metal tab here, and then it seals up. Not quite airtight, but pretty well. During the day, Shaker young boys in the community would come around and dispose of the chamber pots away from the buildings. The Shakers did not really understand disease and germs at the time, but this would have given them an advantage over some of their neighbors in terms of cleanliness in the community. Now, in front of me right now is something that would have been very important. New Hampshire is cold today, and it was even colder, particularly in the first half of the 19th century. And so the Shakers would have needed stoves to keep this building warm. Now, for our taste today, these wood stoves we would have considered this building immensely cold. Probably would have averaged in the mid-50s, maybe the lower 60s. But these stoves would have provided heat for these 20 by 20 bedrooms. And this is a very typical design for the early years of the Greystone dwelling. The Shakers did not have a foundry here. So they would have hired an outside foundry to do the actual casting, but the Shakers designed these stoves. And so today we often call them Shaker stoves. This is just one of many examples that were used in Enfield, and you would have found these in almost all of the retiring rooms in the building. Now, another important aspect of the Shaker retiring rooms is the furniture that goes into them. The Shakers in 1841 published an edition of the Millennial Laws that is specific to Enfield and Canterbury, most likely with this building and some of the expansions in the Canterbury dwelling house in mind. And in these laws, they lay out very particular rules for what is expected to be in each of the retiring rooms. It's hard to know today how much these were followed, but you can often compare these laws with Hervey Elkin's account of the dwelling house in 1853. Hervey talks about what would be in the rooms. One thing that would have been in every room would have been one of these washstands. We have several different versions in the collection of the museum, but this is a good example of the style. This washstand had chrome yellow paint, which is also talked about in the Millennial Laws. They talk about how bedrooms would have chrome yellow washstands, red tables, and green painted beds. Now, if we move over here, another important detail that you find throughout the Greystone dwelling are these built-in shutters. Every window has them. There's different designs. The ones in the dining room look slightly different than the ones in the retiring rooms upstairs. They fold like this, so they would completely close on either side. And then if the Shaker wanted more light in the room, he would simply fold them like this. One of the advantages today of these shutters is the fact that they do provide a little bit of a barrier for heat in the winter. They can help to keep this room insulated, which is particularly a problem when you have single pane glass, which you would have in all of the 150 plus windows in this building. Another detail to point out, and it's a little hard to tell in this retiring room, but if you ever get a chance to visit the Greystone dwelling, you'll see it, is all of these windows had a type of glass known as crown glass. Crown glass was one of the more expensive types of glass that could be purchased, and this was a very intentional decision made in this building. Even though the Shakers were modest often in their design, there's little architectural flourishes or design flourishes in this building that show that this is a healthy community in 1841 when they finished the Greystone dwelling. Now, if we move over to the other side of the retiring room, we'll just see other examples of the type of furniture. Work tables were very common in the Enfield community. And if you scroll over to this area over here, you'll find a set of different Enfield chairs. Every Shaker would have had a side chair, and these side chairs would have been brought down to the next stop in our tour, which is going to be the meeting room. Now we're in the most important room in the Greystone dwelling. This is the meeting room. This is where the Shaker Church Family would have held their worship services. They typically had multiple weeknight services and then a Sabbath service on Sunday. This room was considered sacred for the Shakers. They looked at this entire building as a sacred space, but this room was set apart as a unique space. And in this room, they would have had really two types of worship. So you would have had seated worship focused on testimonies, and then you would have had Shaker dance in this room as well. And so when you look at this whole room here, you can really see the large amount of space here. The room itself is about 50 feet by 45 feet, according to most Shaker accounts. And the entire room would not have had any minimal lighting at the time. There's one account I'm going to read to you just shortly that describes how the room had 2 spirit lamps in the shape of a globe. And that's described by the ministry of Union Village in South Union. And so to just read the rest of that account right now, it starts off, it says, meeting room is 54 by 40 feet, lighted by 2 large spirit globe lamps. I forgot to mention on Sabbath, we had a good time in church meeting. They held their church meeting in the meeting room of the dwelling house. It is large and spacious, and there being but one family in the church, they seldom go to the meeting house to worship, and they have no need to, for they have room enough. Another account of this room is really interesting. It describes how the Shakers in Enfield brought chairs down from their retiring rooms and would meet in this space. This account also seems to talk about how this space was multifunction. It wasn't just for what we think of as spiritual worship, but also for general gatherings of importance. And in this account from 1851 by Freegift Wells, he meets in here with a group of Enfield Shakers and describes his own Shaker experience and his travels throughout the Shaker West in particular. And so he says that about 8:30, elder brother invited me into the house, and at 9 the family assembled in the meeting room with their chairs and seated themselves as we frequently do, and to be sure, they seated me at the head of the meeting as though I was a minister, and wanted that I should tell them some stories and the like. And so this just shows a different use of this space than how we normally think of it. But the most important function was for Shaker's spiritual laboring. So if you follow me over here, I want to show you another important detail. So a unique characteristic of meeting houses and some of the meeting rooms in the eastern Shaker villages are these tiny inlaid dots on the floor. These are called dance cues. And this would allow the Shakers to get into their starting position in a more efficient way. Some Shaker dances were quite complex. Some Shakers took to dance more than others. And so this served as a little bit of a guide for worship on Sunday, so things would go seamlessly. This worship space in here would not have been accessible to the public. This was the church family's private worship space, unlike the old meeting house from 1793 that would have sometimes been used to the public. One other detail I'd like to point out in this space is the large entrance doors on either side. This is one of the few spaces in the building that has this size of door. Additionally, there are closets, 4 in this room, that most likely were used for the storage of holy books, such as hymnals or even possibly King James versions of the Bible. Another important detail of this room is its pure simplicity. On our site, it stands as an incredible contrast with the high church styling of the Lost Slut Chapel next door, and shows sort of the low church Protestant Christianity that the Shakers follow. So now we are in one of my favorite spaces in the entire dwelling house, and that is the cupola on the top of the great stone dwelling. From this vantage point up here, you really get a sense of the size of the community. You can see the surrounding mountains and countryside, and you can see some of the other buildings on our property, like the stone machine shop across the way. In the far distance here, on a really clear day, you can see all the way to the White Mountains, which is a really special experience up here. The most important purpose of this space is to house the bell. So you can see in front of me, this is the bell from 1848. It is a replacement of the original bell on the dwelling house, which cracked sometime in the 1840s. This bell was cast by Major Holbrook of Medway, Massachusetts, and it still sounds as good today as it sounded in 1848. If you look up close here, you can see some of the details on this bell, and this bell is often talked about in Shaker accounts. An account from 1854, they describe how this bell weighed 600 pounds. We estimate today that it weighs about 650 pounds and would have been used as a call to gather Shakers to the dwelling house for meals, worship services, and the like. Thank you for joining us on this special virtual Tuesday tour. There's much more to see here at the Enfield Shaker Museum. We thank you for your support, and we look forward to welcoming you back as soon as it is safe. For more information on Enfield Shaker Museum, please visit us at our website, shakermuseum.org. Stay safe, stay well.